further ado, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. And Bill, I believe we're turning over to your good self to start. Is that correct, sir?
I think. Well, why don't Olivia and I introduce ourselves, and then we'll can talk about DNS abuse. So I'm Bill Woodcock. I'm the chairman of Quad9's board and the executive director of Packet Clearinghouse. Quad9 is a public recursive resolver, so it answers DNS queries for the public at no cost, but donor supported, unlike most other recursive resolvers, which are supported through user data monetization. So this is of privacy interest. And it also provides malware blocking, so optionally. So if users want to have malware and phishing sites blocked so that their machine will not contact them, they can get that service from Quad9. So the reason I'm here today is because we recently received an injunction from Sony Music in the court in Hamburg, Germany, that is well known for dealing with copyright interests. And so later in the 2 hours we have scheduled here, I'll talk a bit more about that, and a bit more about how Quad9 got to this point. Olivier?
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. So I'm Olivier Crépin-Leblond. I'm the chair of the UK chapter of the Internet Society, but I also have been active in the at-large community for at least 10 years, at-large community of ICANN, the organization that coordinates the top-level domains around the world. And of course, the DNS is all about starting from the root with the top-level domains, .net, .org, .de, .uk for the UK. And policy for these gets done at ICANN, but ICANN also has a component part of it with regards to the stability of the internet, and that then segues with the whole issue of DNS abuse. And DNS abuse is one of these things at ICANN that's been discussed for many, many years. We haven't managed to find a single description of what DNS abuse is about. And it's interesting because some use DNS abuse to signify other types of, as Bill said, malware or activities or illegal activities that are taking place. Some of them try and use DNS abuse for their, in order to further some commercial interests and so on. It's quite a complex system altogether. And so I thought that perhaps we could start with the at-large view. Now, the at-large community is the community of end users that takes part in ICANN processes. I thought maybe we could start with a short video. It's only like 10, 15 minutes explaining a little bit what DNS abuse is and the different sort of activities that take place around the DNS. It will give you a quick startup also on how the DNS works for those of you that are not experts in the topic. And then we'll be able to focus after that on the case of the Bill's case that he's going to explain to us. How does that look, Bill?
Sounds good to me. I think I would just encourage everyone to throw questions into the Q&A as we go, so that Olivier and I can tailor our talk to best address your interests.
Yeah, and I don't know, I might ask the people in the room, whoever's the moderator and who's got the sort of power over this whole thing, are we going to allow for questions for people to be able to take the floor using the microphone, or are they just written questions? I should have probably checked that.
In terms of the question, any questions from the floor or any questions in the chat, would you rather handle things at the end, or would you prefer to do it in real time, if you see what I mean? What would be your preference?
We'll probably go through the end, and then we're going to open this. This is going to be a big dialogue and discussion among everyone here. So, but it's just whether people would be speaking, or are they just going to type them?
I think.
Well, why don't we have people put questions into the Q&A as they occur to them, and we can sort of keep an eye on that, and then as we get towards the end, we can switch to a dialogue. And
that was going to be my preference, sir. If that's okay with yourselves.
Sounds perfect. So now I'm going to share sound, and I'm going to optimize for video clip, and I'm going to turn to the video on DNS abuse, and hopefully the technology will not fail us. I'm currently in Turkey. I'm on fiber, so it should be good, but let's find out.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, or for the less fortunate, good middle of the night. Today we're going to discuss DNS abuse, which has only become worse during the COVID-19 crisis. We often hear the term cybercrime, but what is DNS abuse? We're all pretty familiar with the DNS or domain name system by now. It's a fairly sophisticated system of questions and answers that get you to where you want to go on the World Wide Web. It's a bit like a scavenger hunt where you need to ask the person for the name of the person who knows the number of the person you want to reach. Of course, as they say in the movies, all that asking around can get you noticed by the wrong people. Just ask Dorothy as she asks around for the Wizard of Oz. Simply put, DNS abuse is attacks on or criminal use of the DNS. Some people will try to parse this definition further by calling attacks on the DNS, DNS abuse, and attacks using the DNS, DNS misuse. But for our purposes, we're going to call it all DNS abuse. Now we're going to talk about the different types of DNS abuse. Hey, what was that sound?
It's quiz time. That's right. You put them to sleep, and I wake them back up. Your first question is, what is the DNS? A, the Delaware Nature Society. B, the Division of Nuclear Safety, or C, the Domain Name System. If you chose C, the Domain Name System, you would be correct. To be fair, the Delaware Nature Society and the Division of Nuclear Safety are DNSs, but not the kind we've been talking about.
One of the best known attacks on the DNS is a distributed denial of service or DDoS attack. Here, a perpetrator uses a network of zombie computers to make so many requests that a server is overwhelmed. Sometimes a criminal element gets in between you and the servers from which you request information. This can be done with a so-called man-in-the-middle attack, or DNS cache poisoning. Simply put, the idea here is that your queries are intercepted and you're given the wrong number for the site you wish to visit. These server-side redirects can be used for something called a farming attack, sometimes called phishing without a lure. Here, you are simply redirected to a site that looks just like the one you intended, but is just set up to capture your login credentials. You think you're logging on to your bank, but really you're just filling in a form for hackers to go and use on the real bank website. One of the most common abuses using the DNS is phishing. A far less technical way to get you to the wrong server is simply to ask you to go. In this case, you receive an email suggesting something is up with your bank account and that you need to log in to fix it. However, when you click the link, you're taken to a farming site. This process is called phishing because you are lured to the fraudulent site. Here's an example of what such an email might say. You can see there are some key elements to such emails. Some kind of crisis with a short time to remedy so that you don't think about it too much, and a call for you to log into your account. Of course, taking you to a fraudulent site isn't the only use of emails. Sometimes they have attachments that contain malware directly. One area of particular concern to the at-large is internationalized domain names, or IDNs, those domain names using non-Latin characters. These relatively new domains are essential to get the next 4 billion users on the internet. 70% of the world uses non-Latin alphabets, and finally in 2012 we got the ability to register domain names in languages such as Russian, Arabic, and Chinese. Of course, with every new innovation comes matching innovation by the criminals, and IDNs were no different. It turns out that a lot of letters in non-Latin alphabets look a lot like letters in the Latin alphabet. Who knew there were so many ways to spell Bank of America? When someone sees one of these spellings while quickly reading an email, why wouldn't they go ahead and click? In addition to collecting your credentials, these... What?
That's right, it's time for another quiz. What is a denial of service attack? Is it A, when a waitress is upset with you, B, too many requests to a server, or C, coming to the store without shoes? That's right, it's B. Too many requests of a web server. Now, it's true that showing up to a store without shoes might lead to a denial of service, but let's be honest, in that case, it's you who's doing the attacking.
In addition to collecting your credentials, these fraudulent emails and websites have as a primary objective to plant software on your machine. This software is broadly called malware, but there are many varieties of malware. You've heard of these types of programs before, and many of you, or your friends and family, have fallen victim to them. While we don't have time to go into each of them in detail today, suffice it to say, whether it's spyware or ransomware, you don't want them on your computer. Unfortunately, malware infection is on the rise. In the last 10 years, malware infection has gone up nearly 700%. As just an example, ransomware attacks have risen 350% in 2018 alone. In fairness, especially after the review of the 2012 round of TLDs for competition, choice, and consumer trust, the folks in ICANN contract compliance are doing their best. The compliance team began publishing much more granular data about complaints and began to make its audit process a little less random, but it's still not been enough. You might have heard of something called Domain Abuse Activity Reporting, which ICANN began a few years ago. While the monthly DAR reports provide just enough data to know there's a problem, they don't provide enough data to do anything about it, such as avoiding a domain or registrar that seems to be up to no good. However, using DAR, we can determine that the percentage of detected abuse has gone down less than 1% since its inception 2 years ago. So we can all agree DNS abuse is a major problem for individual end users. But what can the at-large do? The at-large plans to take a two-pronged approach to combating DNS abuse: outreach and ICANN policy development. The at-large will develop educational materials for individual end users to better protect themselves against DNS abuse. The at-large is unique in its structure, making it possible to distribute information to the regional at-large organizations, or RALOs, who in turn can distribute these materials to the at-large structures, each of which have individual members to which they can finally distribute these materials. The at-large has been developing this network for years, and what better use than to protect users from criminals on the internet? There are a number of messages we can deliver to help people avoid the traps being set for them every day. It is the enduring irony that criminals get most of the information they need from users not by being clever computer engineers like in the movies, but by being clever social engineers. In short, if they want your password, they basically just ask for it. This was true before the internet, and it remains true today. The at-large need to educate users to be on the lookout for news that's too good or too bad to be true. We like to make fun of those phishing emails because of their bad grammar. What we don't realize is that the bad grammar is intentional. Writing this way simultaneously triggers a deletion by those who recognize the scam and sympathy from those who are less sophisticated. The at-large can certainly help end users to discern the authenticity of an unexpected email. It should go without saying, but the at-large will say it anyway, over and over again, that individual end users should have virus protection software on their PCs and mobile devices. In fact, in the United States, where you would expect considerable sophistication by end users, nearly 50% of computers lack virus protection. The at-large must encourage end users to ask their employers if they have DNSSEC-enabled servers to prevent events such as man-in-the-middle attacks. These are just some of the ways that the at-large can educate individual end users to protect themselves. The other place the at-large needs to be heard is in the hallways, meetings, and conference calls that make up ICANN policy development process. The at-large will engage in ICANN policy development at every point of entry. In one case, it might be a conversation in a hallway or participation in a workgroup or review team. We will actively engage in advocacy for reforms both inside ICANN and among the businesses that serve end users, such as registrars and registries. In other words, if someone asks us about the weather, we stick out our hand and look up at the sky and say, "It feels like DNS abuse." Thankfully, we're not alone. The majority of the ICANN community is concerned about DNS abuse and hesitant to allow a new round without significant reform. There's simply no way that a minority of voices should be able to drive ICANN to a new round without real buy-in from the rest of the community. The at-large has and will continue to partner with other groups within ICANN community to sound the alarm regarding DNS abuse and actively promote reform. Our task is to hold the line. There should be no new round until DNS abuse is addressed in a meaningful way. Compliance needs a holistic view of DNS abuse. They cannot simply react to complaints, but must use their audit power to recognize high percentages of abuse and take action against TLDs, registries, and registrars who are part of the problem. One thing we should make sure to do is limit volume registrations because there's a high correlation to DNS abuse. Of course, there are legitimate uses for bulk registrations, and such uses will only increase with the Internet of Things. But the at-large will continue to advocate for increased friction for such activity, perhaps requiring authentication as a legitimate bulk registrant. The CCT review team, and consequently the Security and Stability review team, have both suggested that ICANN design incentives to adopt best practices. The at-large will continue to advocate for such incentives. Certainly more research can be done and has been recommended by the CCTRT, the SSRT, the ALAC, and now VeriSign. There's now essentially $20 million more in the budget to invest in security and stability of the DNS. There are certainly those registries and registrars that are investing significant time and money in combating DNS abuse. In fact, 48 companies have signed on to a commitment to best practices. That's awesome, but we still need reforms to better address the bad actors, and frankly, even the good actors could be doing better. So the at-large won't be easing up on those guys anytime soon either. It's like that old Dilbert cartoon in which we are reminded that once everyone has adopted so-called best practices, these practices become the new normal and are no longer the best. The criminals are not satisfied with the status quo, and neither can we afford to be. All that is to say that this is a crisis from which no one is immune. Incredible research is happening in machine learning to better detect abuse in real time and predict that a registration is intended for illegal use. Early tests of such technology by .eu show a nearly 80% accuracy in such predictions. We need to ensure that such research continues and systems are put in place to protect us from the next generation of attacks.
That sound means it's time for your last question. Which of the following are tools to combat DNS abuse? A. Education. B. Implementing DNSSEC. Or C. End-to-end encryption. If you chose all of them, you are correct. If you didn't, please stay after class.
When all is said and done, there's really only one constituency: end users. It's the interests of those end users the at-large was created to advance. DNS abuse affects all of them. Say it with me. We have no use for DNS abuse. Go to atlarge.wiki/DNSabuse for more information.
All right. So that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. It did sound a bit like. Let me just turn this off. There you go. It did sound a little bit like an ad for at-large, but I thought it would be interesting to watch it to give you a bit of an example of the work that is taking place in ICANN with regards to DNS abuse, and with also the different organizations and companies that run the internet. There's a significant amount of work taking place out there, but unfortunately, some are taking alternative paths and seem to be shooting in all directions. And that's the sort of thing that's happened with what Bill is going to talk to you about in a moment, where processes are not being followed, and effectively tribunals are being asked to take stances or make decisions on things which often they're not fully aware of, or they don't quite know much about. And you end up with things that are tagged as being DNS abuse or malware or criminal activity, when actually the courts are being used for other activities, such as either bullying, I guess, on the one hand, or one would say trying to stifle free speech, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I'll hand the floor over to Bill, who's going to take you through what his company has been put through.
Thank you, Olivier.
So basically, as I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, Quad 9 is a nonprofit that was established to provide private and secure recursive DNS. Specifically, I guess this was in 2016, early 2017 era. The Gdpr was coming along, and prior to that, there were basically two big public resolvers. There was the OpenDNS resolver, which David Ulevich and I built back in 2005, and then a few years later, Google started one. OpenDNS was a for-profit startup that was sort of security focused with a wide range of filtering options that subscribers could turn on at will. And it was not really doing monetization. Google got into this for the purpose of monetizing the data. And so they promoted their recursive resolver very heavily, and it quickly gained the dominant market share. The other operator in the space that was also monetizing oriented is Nominum, but Nominum took a completely different tack. Rather than getting users to opt in, they went to network operators who had already existing recursive resolvers and said, you know, let us take over operation of this IP address, and you'll no longer have a cost center here. And that happened much more quietly because, of course, recursive resolvers operated by internet service providers, by network operators, you know, the user doesn't really think about, they haven't opted into it. They're not, you know, looking at policies and making a choice. So then we get to the point where GDPR is starting to become imminent. People are thinking about what GDPR is going to mean. And privacy regulators in Europe began getting bombarded by Google lobbyists who were asking for one-off exemption to the GDPR for their recursive resolver, saying essentially that because a lot of people used it, there wasn't a subscription business model available, and they needed to make money on it, else they would withdraw it and the internet would collapse, and that would be a bad thing. Therefore, they needed this one-off exemption, and it could be one-off because as long as they were doing it for the world, nobody else needed to. This argument did not impress regulators, but many of them encountering this all new for the first time among, you know, a host of different GDPR issues, were a little overwhelmed. So PCH, the main organization that I'm involved with, got a lot of requests from the regulators saying, help us understand this. Why are they asking for this? Do any of these arguments hold water? And basically, our answer was no. This is just self-interest, and of course, everybody who's making money monetizing PI would love to have a one-off exemption, but the whole purpose of GDPR is to not do that. So that the back and forth continued because, of course, Google has near infinite money for lobbyists to pursue agendas, and as long as they hadn't succeeded, they were going to continue trying. So eventually it became apparent that what was really needed was an existence proof, a recursive resolver that was better and faster and more secure, and also private and didn't monetize data. So we started approaching our donors and saying, hey, do you want us to spend your money on this? And got very favorable response. And then we got a completely unrelated request from a consortium of cybersecurity interests saying, hey, the DNS, there are more and more kinds of problems that are enabled by, essentially by DNS abuse, by use of the DNS for phishing and for distribution of malware and for malware command and control and for data exfiltration. And these problems that are enabled by the DNS can also be solved within the DNS, and recursive resolver is the best place to do that. So could you stand up a recursive resolver that does that? And cybersecurity is a huge portion of our mandate. So we looked at that and said, yeah, that's also a reasonable request. Now, the problem with DNS recursive resolvers is that you have to choose one. And users often think, well, I'll put several in that list. But the problem is that any specific DNS query is only ever going to go to one resolver, or at least it's only ever going to get answered by one resolver. So, if you put 3 different resolvers in the list, they're going to have 3 different sets of policy, and you're going to get one of those, but you're never going to know which one with respect to any particular query. So it's actually not a good idea to put DNS recursive, to use multiple DNS recursive resolvers if you are choosing them based on policy. If you just want resilience in the event of a complete failure of one of them, then having ones from different operators is fine, but you need to be very aware of what the privacy trade-offs are there. So anyway, the problem with that is that if we did a high privacy resolver, and we also did a high security resolver, users would have to choose one or the other. They'd get security or privacy, yet it would cost us twice as much to stand up 2 of them as to stand up 1. So clearly the answer here is to build one recursive resolver that serves both functions, gives users both advantages, and we only have to build one global infrastructure. So we did that. We combined these 2 projects and made the donors very happy, and built at this point sort of a 3rd global recursive resolver on top of the OpenDNS and Google ones, which is, it's much larger than the OpenDNS, now Cisco one. It has fewer users, but is much larger in infrastructure than the Google one, which is how we get the better performance. But it's very different in terms of focus. Again, we're not collecting any user data at all. So ironically, you'd think that this would put us at odds with law enforcement, but many of the very first users were law enforcement, and we've been hugely advocated for by the law enforcement community because of the cybersecurity protections. So the City of London police, for instance, were among the beta users, and the entire city of New York runs on it, the city offices and all of the parks and schools and libraries and so forth. So there's a lot of institutional use of it because of the cybersecurity aspect, but then also institutions like privacy as well. Now, up until a month ago, we hadn't really ever run into Sony per se, except as a publisher of malware. If you look up Sony rootkit on Wikipedia, you'll go down a very long rabbit hole of incidents in which Sony has published malware in an attempt to infect people's machines and gain control of them to advance Sony's interests in their copyrights and marketing and so forth. But this was being done mostly through CD and DVD distribution, not through the DNS, so it wasn't really our particular issue. Now, we, as a matter of convenience, had temporarily incorporated in the United States. Specifically, we'd incorporated in Berkeley, California, which in Northern California is the same federal district court that Google is incorporated in, that Cisco is incorporated in. And as several other major recursive resolvers got underway after Quad 9, they all turned out to be incorporated in the Northern District Court of California as well, which is not a lot of diversity. It had always been our intention to move Quad 9 to a jurisdiction, to a legal domicile, which enforced GDPR or GDPR equivalent. But, the legal efforts and policy efforts were in a lot of ways slower than the technical efforts. It take more time to get things done. And so while we were, on the technical side, ramping up this huge project, the effort to find a permanent domicile and analyze the legal environment took 4 years. And during that time, we narrowed it down. The final 3 were Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Iceland. And ultimately, we selected Switzerland for a number of reasons. Privacy laws are criminal laws rather than civil laws, and that gives users recourse regardless of the location or citizenship of the user. So someone in Indonesia who believes that we violated their privacy can submit a complaint to the Swiss privacy regulator, and it becomes a criminal matter between the Swiss government and Quad 9. And the location of the person whose privacy would have been violated would become completely irrelevant at that point. So that's unlike EU, GDPR, countries which are principally looking after the interests of their own citizens. So that was an improvement over the EU countries. There were a number of other findings of law that were immensely beneficial from a privacy perspective. And the privacy and cybersecurity were, since those are our focus, those were the issues that had our attention in making this selection. The problem, which we were made aware of in June, is that just a few days after we re-domiciled to Switzerland, Sony Music decided to use us to advance their copyright agenda because we were no longer defended by the Federal District Court of Northern California, which would not entertain such silliness. Instead, there is a a treaty between a number of countries, which unfortunately includes both Switzerland and Germany, that says that in civil cases, if a civil court decides a matter between two private parties, neither one a governmental party, that the damages can be applied regardless of the country of domicile, as long as it's one of the signatory countries, and regardless of the location of the court, and that no standing needs to be established for the use of any particular court. So this is ideal grounds for jurisdiction shopping, for finding a specific court that is friendly to a specific notion, getting a finding there and applying it in a completely other country, which, you know, the US does not subscribe to. So companies domiciled in the US are protected from this kind of attack. None of this had really been on our minds because, you know, we aren't involved with copyright stuff. We're not, it's not our issue, as the kids say online, not our monkeys, not our circus. But this circus got pitched on our doorstep, and Sony hired a private investigator firm to do a whole lot of queries for a website that is an index to perhaps copyright infringing material. And they did those queries using Quad 9 between the time when we moved to Switzerland in February and June, when they succeeded in getting an injunction against us, an emergency injunction, which we were not notified of until 3 weeks after the injunction was found. Right, so we had no knowledge of any of this as it was happening. And if you look at the court documents, they show that the court accepted all of Sony's assertions about us and all of Sony's translations to German of our public documents, with the note that they seemed plausible, which is an interesting way to conduct a court. But you know, German law is very different from British law or US law, as we are finding to our detriment. So, you know, we could sort of sit this out. We could, as a Swiss organization, appeal to the Swiss courts and say, hey, is this really how this treaty was meant to be used? Because the Swiss courts, the Swiss Supreme Court has found that even in the case of a Swiss film producer and a Swiss internet service provider, the Swiss internet service provider's direct customer was hosting infringing copies of this Swiss produced film. Even in this case, the internet service provider was not held to be liable or compelled to act on the interest of the film producer. So Switzerland is very, very clear that copyright holders need to go after the infringer directly, not, you know, third parties, even if those third parties have a commercial relationship with the infringer and are profiting from the infringement. So Swiss law is very, very clear in its position. But in Germany, there's this interesting legal theory that I understand came out of sort of reaction to Nazism after World War II, that a bystander is equally culpable with the perpetrator of an act if the bystander has not taken action to try to stop the act, regardless of whether the bystander has any possibility of actually stopping the act, and regardless of the personal cost to the bystander in trying. That the failure to act creates the guilt. And essentially in sentencing, proportionality is taken into account regarding, the possibility of success and the personal cost. But this is sort of after establishment of guilt. So this was the legal theory that was brought to the court in Hamburg, saying that because Quad 9 exists, because Quad 9 answers DNS queries, that Quad 9 could have acted to block DNS queries that would, at some many stages of remove down the road, result in a user being connected to infringing content. They did not assert that Quad 9 had any connection with the user, nor with the infringing content, nor with the infringer, nor with any service provider to the infringer. And they're very clear about that because they already have, done cases like that where they've managed to win in different courts. And this is a step further. This is saying that anyone who could cause the internet to break must do so, else be held equally liable with the infringer. In this case, 250,000 euros per event. And I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I think that comes to potentially 10 to the 22nd euros in damages that the court was potentially awarding without them clearly having done the math, because that vastly, like by many, many, many orders of magnitude, exceeds the gross global product. So where this leaves us is with a presumption of guilt because something happened on the internet, and hypothetically we could have stopped it by making all or a portion of the internet unavailable to all or a portion of people if they chose to allow us to do so, and we didn't take action. That would be antithetical. That action would be antithetical to our purpose. Our purpose is to answer DNS queries. Not answering a DNS query is the opposite of what people turn to us for. Beyond this, the damages are held to apply because we should have had a duty of care, or Sony asserts that we have a duty of care to investigate every possible DNS answer and determine whether it could lead to someone infringing their intellectual property before we answer it. So doing this tens of millions of times per second as non-intellectual property lawyers somehow doesn't really seem possible. And applying this standard to DNS operators seems like a very bad precedent. And so we choose not to hide behind Swiss courts any more than we were hiding behind US courts. And many different German legal parties have come to our aid. And so we are challenging all of this and seeking to have, first of all, the injunction overturned, but we see this appealed up to a higher court that could establish a precedent that would prevent this from occurring again, prevent, the next similar case from being brought in Germany against someone else. And we happen to be a DNS operator, but this principle applies equally to publishers of operating systems, to firewall manufacturers, to web browser authors. Anyone who could break the internet and fails to do so is culpable by Sony's legal theory. It also, for what it's worth, applies equally to the electrical power grid, right? The electrical power grid could be shut down in order to prevent infringement. And this theory applies equally to that. So you can see that this is vast overreach, but it needs to be teased out in the open in order to get the legal finding that it is overreach and to get the public understanding that this is not how the courts are to be used, and this is not a reasonable presumption for how the internet will work. So I think I'm done here with the overview.
Bill, Dave Marcel, just a quickie. Is this in conflict with the rights of the individual in some way under the GDPR? I think it's section 85 in terms of that. Right.
So I am not a legal expert by any means, and I'm particularly not a legal expert on either GDPR or copyright. So I am at this point merely parroting things that I have heard legal experts say. So yes, it is my understanding that the rights of the individual include a right of choice in how they pursue information online, and that censorship, there's something about essentially European citizens not being involuntarily censored in such a way that all possible options block their ability to seek information, regardless of whether the information is legal or not legal or whatever, right? That it's sort of separate from what courts have found about the information, that you have a right to seek information, and that there is also a right by individual parties to block access to information, but that right is limited if all parties block the information, making it thus unavailable. So there are a lot of different legal theories in a lot of different jurisdictions, and I am not the expert on this, but there are people who are.
We're not there either. So thank you, Bill. That's been pretty good, and obviously it's not a good situation. Olivier, have you got any thoughts at the moment?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Olivier Crapin-Leblanc speaking. One thing I was going to add, and the situation here is pretty terrible in that, as from my presentation, you will have seen there is an extensive amount of work going on about defining DNS abuse in itself, and ICANN does not deal with content. That's one thing which I think everyone agrees on. But that being said, when it comes down to malware and the kind of criminal activity that you see here, a lot of it is being dealt with using I would say, the proper channels, if you want, with registrars and registries taking down domains that have been flagged as being illegal or as promoting illegal activity. And that's often a contract between the person who has purchased the domain and the registrar that has sold the use of the domain to them. And unfortunately, we then have these court cases that come in and that use what I might even say as loopholes in some way, because obviously the law isn't the same in all the countries, and just relocating to Switzerland, it's put the Cloud9 into this organization, into this position there where they are now being attacked. And there is, in the meantime, a lot of discussion going on in internet governance circles, and certainly the Internet Governance Forum has several sessions on this about intermediary liability, where so far there hasn't been an overall set of rules or characteristics and so on that define the extent to which intermediaries or service providers that do not have a direct contact with the end perpetrator, what their liability is. And although there have been some court cases, these have not been even in all the countries. So some have gone in one direction and some have gone in another direction. I deplore personally the fact that you do have these court cases that seem to be defining policy rather than policy being developed with the whole all sides, if you want, being listened to, and ending up with a system and a process by which there is enforcement on the one hand, but also recourse that is possible, and suitable protections for abuse by either side. Because what we're seeing here is abuse by one of the sides that seems to be trying to overstep the way and say, hey, you know, we will go and we'll not only just target the target, which it obviously is conducting, is, you know, infringing on something. We're not going to go after them. We'll go after everyone. And that's the, you know, that is a sort of way not to do things, because what you do end up with at the end of the day is the opening of the ability of freedom of speech to be curbed because of the precedents, and having a system by which censorship is then made as something that is acceptable, which of course it isn't.
I think one of the interesting things here is that you know, Quad 9 is fairly law and order oriented in the first place. As I said, you know, a huge portion of our user base is law enforcement and government, and you know, they choose us for cybersecurity protection. You know, we're not out there with the Pirate Bay, you know, advocating for you know, free distribution of other people's intellectual property. Simply not our issue. And you know, if 6 months ago, if 2 months ago, you had asked me whether you know, I was for, you know, music piracy, I would have said no. You know, the artists have a right to be paid and have a right to choose their publisher, and the publisher is their agent for collecting those payments and so forth, right? It's not really not my issue. But and further than that, you know, Quad 9 commits in all our policies to follow the law of every country we operate in. And if we can't morally reconcile our principles with the law of a country, then we don't operate in that country, which is simple and, you know, straightforward policy. So if a court had come to us and said, you know, there is harmful material here, or there is an intellectual property violation that is so egregious that the court is finding that you need to block this, we would have said, well, let's look at this and see whether it violates our principles. And if it doesn't violate our principles, yeah, we probably would have found a way to block it. But that's not what this case is seeking to do. This case is seeking prior restraint. This case is saying that we're culpable because we didn't already do this in advance of a court order. This is seeking to create a chilling effect. This is seeking to get DNS operators to respond to requests from the intellectual property community without any finding of law, without any finding of, you know, a violation that a court will identify. And that is just, that's beyond the pale, that's beyond reasonable. And you can see that they've already achieved this with the internet service provider community in many countries. There are now many of these voluntary cooperation regimes where internet service providers will receive block lists from the intellectual property community without checking them or anything, without any court or government saying that this is something that should happen. And they just block it all wholesale because they don't want to wind up back in court. They don't want to wind up, you know, on the receiving end of Sony's lawyers. And this chilling effect, again, they're just trying to spread the coverage of this chilling effect beyond the ISPs that actually may have a profitable relationship with an infringer to completely unrelated third parties. So that's what we're seeking to check. Should we turn to some of the questions, get more discussion going?
What I was going to suggest, Bill's Paul, did you want to work through the questions on the chat and then we can open the door afterwards, if that's okay with yourself and Olivier?
Sure.
Can you
Sure.
see what ones in the chat so far?
Yeah. So Andrew Campling asks, thinking specifically about malware filtering, do you agree that the default offerings from DNS resolver operators for the mass market should include such filtering as recommended by the European Resolver Policy? See europeanresolverpolicy.com. So let me first address it in principle before looking at the URL and trying to figure out the case by case. Again, Quad 9's position is that we follow the law in every country in which we operate, and we make a decision about whether to operate in any country based on the compatibility of law there with our moral principles. Thus far, there have been no countries in which we have been legally asked to do anything which is incompatible with our principles. To be very blunt, we had expected to first encounter such an incompatibility in either the Middle East or China, not Germany. And so this is the first time we've had to consider withdrawing service from a country. I mean, as a sort of practical rubber meets the road matter. And so this first question of whether something is legally required is of interest. And then secondly, there's question of what we block beyond what we are legally required to block, which right now is nothing. And what we would block beyond that is what we advertise that we block, which is malware and phishing and things that we consider to be cybersecurity abuses. And we work with many, several dozen threat analysts that give us their estimation of what domains are cybersecurity threats to users. Right now, this is about 4 million domains at any given time, with about a 10% daily churn. So about 400,000 new domains coming on the list every day and old ones leaving, which is a lot. This is far, far more than individual human beings are making determinations about. So Quad 9's expertise is not in cybersecurity malware filtering. It is in reconciling the analytic results of different cybersecurity analysts and creating an amalgam of their results that has a low false positive rate. So our expertise is actually not in blocking, but in unblocking. We take many, sorry, say again?
Olivier's got some experience in this space as well. I don't know if he wanted to say something there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't catch you.
I said you have some experience in this space as well, so perhaps you can tell us what you can see.
Well, what I find with time, is the whole experience on blocking of first there's the DNS blocking on the one hand, which Bill has spoken about. There's also the IP blocking, which we've also spoken about. The difficulty is that often we've seen that the requesters for such blocking have been overreaching and have effectively been asking for a whole block of IP addresses to be blocked. And for one website that operates under the block of IP addresses that might be infringing on whatever it is, there's a lot of other victims out there that have nothing to do with it, and we've seen that happen again and again in this space. Bill, I'm sure, has got tons of examples that he could give on that. And for those of us that also have links with the industry and that have worked for many years on this, we would have thought that over years, this sort of thing happened 10, 15 years ago. We would have thought that there would have been lessons learned, and this kind of accidental thing did not happen again and again, and it still does. And
Can I
it's
ask you a
more
question?
widespread. Yeah, go ahead.
Important question from my viewpoint. I have a view, and I haven't changed my view since I started doing internet in the 80s, which is that DNS is pan-national infrastructure. Now, there's a lot of hype about CNI, and I think the thing that's screwed up in Germany is precisely the thing that you're victim to, which is that safety and security are one word in German. So they have a very extreme view. So the question I'd ask you is, and I'm not asking Bill deliberately, I'm asking you to say it, do you feel, and I don't know if the EU will ever have this concept of pan-national infrastructure, but do you feel that there should be an exemption for this case on the grounds that it's pan-national infrastructure?
That's it's a tough question that you're asking, because I think that exemptions are always on a case-by-case basis. And I think that when it comes down to the DNS, it is indeed pan-national. It is, the internet has no boundaries as such. And, you know, there's a real clash of cultures, if you want, between national laws and the non-national nature of the internet. Unfortunately, many politicians and policy makers that are not internet policy makers, but people that are out there and say, right, we have to make policy for the government, see nationalization of resources being one thing. What I mean by nationalization of resources is, well, we're going to have the UK internet. I'll give you an example. The UK internet will be the safest in the world. I have no idea what that means. I really don't know what one means by this. Does it mean that we're going to cut off the UK internet from it, along with the IXPs being amongst the largest in the world, IXPs being the internet exchange points? You don't have 1, 2, 3, 4 entry points to the UK internet. It's interconnected, and the networks are span the whole globe. So how would you then say that you're going to have to follow every single national legislation when you are running a network that spans so many different countries? At that point, you really run the risk of ending up with the lowest common multiple, which effectively means you'll have the strongest laws out there that bring full censorship. We're speaking of some Middle Eastern countries, for example.
You might argue that the French regulator, one of the 27, CNIL, would very strongly defend this stance for Bill. And it's just the fact that if the GDPR is going to have substance, and we're out now, so we don't decide in the UK, then surely it needs to protect its pan-national infrastructure.
Where do you stop? Where do you stop? And what do they mean by protecting the infrastructure? There's one thing which I always see with those initiatives that governments launch. It's that they mix everything together. So they mix the informational. I always see the internet as being, the layered architecture as such. And they mix this whole thing of having the information that's on the internet, the infrastructure that carries that information, and then the underlying information, the underlying infrastructure that actually is the fabric of the network itself.
Well, I'll just leave one challenge, which is back to Bill. Bill, you have already said that your infrastructure is used by, for example, the City of London Police. We're in the City of London. I mean, just in terms of policing, and I know Paul's got experience with his local policing, how much trust does the policing network have in your DNS and your systems and your procedures? I mean, surely that alone must make a legal case to protect you.
Well, so first of all, I think intellectual property in some ways is the clearest example of why a nation by nation policy is required of global or pan-national operators. That there wouldn't be intellectual property law if there weren't conflicts. in intellectual property. There wouldn't be national patents and national trademarks and national copyrights if you couldn't have similar material in different countries or different regimes. So this is actually a really clear example of why overreach is a particular problem in reconciling national legal findings with pan-national services. You look at something like child porn, and everyone can basically say, if this is a problem for anyone, it's a problem for everyone. You look at malware, and you can basically say, if this is a problem for anyone, it's a problem for everyone. Therefore, as a pan-national operator, I can easily have a moral principle that if something is found anywhere, regardless of whether a court has bothered to rule on it or not, I can protect users from it everywhere. And that's easy to do because I don't have to identify who the user is. I don't have to know their citizenship. I don't have to know their domicile. None of those issues become technologically problematic for me. On the other hand, if I have a court in one country that says that a certain piece of music belongs to one party and a court in another country that says it belongs to another party, and each of these parties is infringing in the other country, now I have two irreconcilable legal findings, which, as long as they are properly scoped to within their own jurisdiction, are not a problem. But the moment a court in one jurisdiction is able to influence the operation of the real world in a different jurisdiction, you create the potential for conflict. And with intellectual property, that's actually worse than most kinds of conflict because it's more likely to happen. So I think this really illustrates the nature of the problem here. Now, law enforcement using our services and placing trust in them, ultimately, we're doing the same for law enforcement as we are for any other party. But I think there's the principle of least user astonishment that comes into play here. This is a principle that is used in doing user interface design for systems online and software and so forth. What it says basically is that all else aside, you want to do the thing that will surprise the user least, that will most conform with the user's expectations of a service. If we say that we are a security and privacy protecting DNS service, a user is expecting us to interfere on their behalf when necessary to protect their security and privacy, not to protect Sony's profits. That's a different issue. If somebody wanted to set up a DNS resolver that exists to maximize Sony's profits, that's fine, and users could choose to use that resolver if they wished, but I suspect the City of London Police would not choose that one for themselves because they're looking for a specific outcome, and that's an outcome that we are geared to provide, and we're not geared to maximize Sony's revenue, just not our fight. So I think the question of user trust generally, and the trust of law enforcement and government and critical infrastructure folks more specifically, really relates very closely to this question of least user astonishment. Is the service that they're choosing to use providing the effect that they understand it to be providing? Or is it overreaching and being used to affect other goals that they're unaware of? So I think this is really important. It's also, this also gets in fairly deep into the operation of the DNS itself, because right now there's very little authentication done of servers. So you see this effort, there's something that's happening with web browsers bypassing the user's selected DNS operator and going to a different DNS operator that the web browser vendor selects. And this is very problematic and dangerous, because the user, one way or other, either the user or their administrator or the administrator of the site the user is at, someone has made a conscious decision which recursive resolver to utilize. And if then a software vendor bypasses that selection with a different selection without the user's informed consent or choice, that's potentially removing a security protection from the user without their knowledge. So worse than that even is if the user thinks that they've selected something, they've done a conscious action, they've been told, yes, this has been taken into account, and then that choice is not respected. So we get into this deep rabbit hole of whether the DNS recursive resolver that the user has selected is the one that they're actually talking to, whether the identification, the authentication of that resolver has been performed, whether a failure to authenticate is then reported back to the user as a failure, or is silently just ignored and a different resolver substituted in place. So the net effect of this, for instance, could be that a law enforcement agency has selected a recursive resolver on the basis of its privacy and security policy, and unbeknownst to them, the browser operator nullifies that selection and instead directs them to a recursive resolver that monetizes search results. And so suddenly the things that the police are doing in their office become a dossier that anyone can buy. It's not really where we want to wind up. And the problem is that the sort of panopticon commercial surveillance environment has so outstripped the development of privacy technologies and regulation that we're just in a very bad place right now. And a lot of work needs to happen in that area.
Thank you, Bill. I mean, I'd hate to think what you're seeing around the Pegasus software and stuff like that.
Yeah. So shall we move on to the Kurt's question? Was it intended to move Quad 9 entirely to Switzerland or just expand?
Bill,
as...
if I
Yep.
Bill,
Okay.
if I can jump in, just were you alluding to DNS over HTTPS, DOH?
Yeah, exactly. DOH. So the problem with DOH is that we've got sort of application layer bypassing of operating system, otherwise operating a system enforced selections. And so we've got competing mechanisms in the standards for enacting policy where the user isn't necessarily aware which mechanism takes precedence. And the mechanisms that have historically taken precedence for the last 30 years are being silently bypassed. So
it's interesting because DOH is being marketed as a way to have more secure requests, because of course internet service providers and anyone in between could be listening to the DNS requests in the normal DNS, the sort of usual DNS, and derive some information from that, or track a user's browsing habits, etc., from that. But it's interesting because there undeniably is someone that's going to have that information, and when it goes to DOH, the request will be made over secure hypertext transfer protocol, hence DOH. But of course, that will then be treated by a different set of resolvers that will be owned by someone or by a group of organizations that will also have access to that information. It's an interesting thing. And one of the problems, obviously, is not only do you have this potential confusion of the end user who doesn't know what is being used, but also different responses, whether there's an end user is sending an email that is not using DOH, or browsing the internet using the browser that is using DOH. Of course, at the moment, this is being marketed as, well, no, we're going to keep exactly the same information, but we all know how long promises last on the internet. You can look at the early Google end user agreements and see how many times they've been updated since the late 90s. And you'll see how companies evolve, and it's absolutely fine. We know that business evolves on the net, but it's a big question mark, this DOH, and certainly from an at-large point of view. And there, sort of looking back at the ICANN side, where you have a community of people that develop policies for this. One of our concerns was the policy for DOH. How is that established? That's certainly not an open policy established by a multi-stakeholder set of actors. So we had quite some concerns and fears about it. Just like what you mentioned here. That's all I want to say.
I would argue that DOH is not really a good faith protocol. It's not. It was never really intended to solve the stated problem. The problem of privacy of DNS queries was solved by DOT, DNS over TLS. HTTPS is HTTP over TLS. It's for web traffic, and it uses the TLS protocol to ensure privacy and authenticity of the server. TLS is the protocol that is intended for this purpose. It is an underlying protocol that sits underneath protocols like email and web and DNS and so forth. So the sort of technically correct way to give privacy in the DNS is to swap out TCP and put in TLS, and you're done. Nice and simple. It's how protocols are supposed to work. They're supposed to be modular that way. And that already existed and was already widely deployed. We had, many tens of millions of users of that before HTTPS was ever conceived of. The problem with TLS is that it was reducing the number of parties who could collect information about users and monetize it. So the companies that were in the business of collecting information about users and monetizing it reacted very poorly to TLS and suggested DOH as an alternative. What DOH gives them is the ability to do stack fingerprinting of the user. So before, let's say a user is completely unencrypted and moves from college to coffee shop to apartment and then back to college again the next day. They have originated their DNS queries from 3 different locations, 3 different IP addresses. Each of those IP addresses is almost certainly a NAT and is shared with many other users. And there's no connection between each of these 3 pools of users. So the user and their queries have effectively been anonymized, even if the privacy of the query string itself has not been protected, because they've been grouped together with other users, and then their traffic has been spread across 3 different groups. So it's not bad. I mean, it's not great, but it's not bad. If you then move them to TLS, they get that protection. Plus, they also get the privacy of the query string. The query string is no longer in clear text. So this was a good incremental building block. It solved a real problem and didn't introduce any new problems. What HTTPS gives them is a stack, this web browsing stack that's already been hugely optimized for fingerprinting users. It includes a vast amount of unique data about each user. So if you switch a user from DOT to DOH, that user can now be identified individually as they move from location to location, and their traffic can be separated out from the traffic of other users behind that same NAT. So this vastly decreased user privacy. The notion that encryption solves all problems is being abused here to camouflage the opposite, so a decrease in privacy rather than increase. So DOH is really, really problematic. It also enables some horrible net neutrality violations on the CDN side, but that's, you know, a completely other another discussion. Let's see.
Let's have a look at the questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew Campling was just chiming in about the DOH. Yeah, exactly. When a problem gets solved for the second time, worse, you have to assume that the interests involved were not quite what they were portrayed to be. So Kurt's question was intended to move Quad 9 entirely to Switzerland or just expand as Anycast instance into another region. So Quad 9 is already global in scope, more than 100 countries that we have server clusters in, 240 locations, several of them in Switzerland already at that point. The goal was purely jurisdictional and regulatory. It has nothing to do with the operations. It's entirely a matter of placing Quad 9 under a jurisdiction that has criminal penalties for doing the things that we say we don't do. In the US, our privacy policy is entirely voluntary, as is the privacy policy of any company in the US. At most, it's a contract between them and a paying user. But for a free service, there is no such contract. So no privacy policy associated with a free service is binding unless that privacy policy is aligned with criminal law, with a jurisdictional component to enforce it. And the US has no such privacy laws. I mean, there are a few things that get referred to as privacy law in the US, but essentially, there is no real privacy law in the US, not in the way that Europeans would consider to be privacy law. So effectively, the entire world's recursive resolver options, all of the recursive resolver options, 99.99 something percent of the recursive resolvers people were using were under the jurisdiction of this single court in Northern California. Anything that court chose not to entertain, they were completely safe from. And by and large, that court was not friendly to user privacy complaints. If you went to that court and said, I believe that Google is abusing my personal information, it was tough luck. You're European, we're American, Google's American. If Google were to pay taxes, they would pay taxes in America. Of course, they'd be wrong about that, but so the American courts provide vast protections to companies domiciled in the US, that those companies are largely not even aware of that benefit they're getting. By contrast, companies trying to start in Europe, tech companies in Europe, at some point get big enough to sort of be on the radar of companies like Sony, and European courts and European legislation simply don't have their back. And so you hear a lot of complaints within European policy circles about how tech companies move to the US, tech companies get bought by US companies, tech companies, choose to start in the US rather than in Europe. And, it is true, and there's a reason for it. It's not just some big coincidence or conspiracy. European courts, this that's happening to us right now, no way this ever possibly could have happened to us in the US. And Sony knows that. And so Sony never tried this. Everybody in this space was incorporated in the US. Mere days after we moved to Switzerland, bam, we get hit with this because they know they can get away with it. They use the Lugano Convention and pick the jurisdiction in a Lugano Convention country that is most favorable to them and use it to enforce it on us in a completely different country. So So yeah, the original intention was not specifically to move to Switzerland. It was to find the best domicile for the protection of user rights, and Switzerland turned out to be that after a long 4-year process of comparison. Olivier, do you want to pick one of the questions out of either the chat or the Q&A?
The next one was for you again, Bill. It was regarding what the primary issue was, whether resolvers should be used to stop copyright infringement, or whether an expectation of proactive action is reasonable rather than action after receiving a court order, or whether Sony Music in this case should reimburse the cost of taking.
Sony has certainly not offered to reimburse any of the very substantial costs that would be involved in enacting what they're asking for. Their argument, of course, is that because we can block malware, therefore we must also be able to block anything they ask for.
So, Bill, there is another tack. The previous president of the IET, one of our Royal Charter holders, was a senior VP, certainly for Sony in Europe. So just from the engineering deficit and the threat to pan-national infrastructure, we would actually, I don't think, be beyond the pale by raising that as a professional issue to our peers. So very simply put, the issues that we have are not with Sony, but with Sony Music. And it perhaps needs to be the case that their board needs to be aware of the game they're playing. I mean, ultimately, you might just be forced to pull out of Germany. There might be a minor ruling. But even that, it just, with your summary, once we get some EU people on board, and I think ICANN has some good interfaces. I mean, we certainly had ex-diplomats here that have joined ICANN. And I think it is the case that just hopefully a bit more awareness, and after this summer, by about September, we'll get the sensible people in. But I would say to you very firmly, I know why you're not here in the UK, but the City of London is a corporation, and the City of London Police is a private police force in all but name. It's structured as a UK police force to defend the City of London and to defend the likes of companies and institutions like yourself. It just astounds me that the beer Keller mentality of the Nazis is still having a chilling effect, used by Sony Music people without realizing how insulting that is to me as the son of a Jew. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this chilling and overreach thing is really the essence of this. And you know, whether it's Sony Music or some other company, there will always be someone who will take advantage of a law that favors them if it exists. And so the question is, how far can that be allowed to affect other people before someone stands up and says, no, this is overreach? And you know, the private profit interests of one company should not be affecting users globally that company has no connection with. Users who are in different jurisdictions, who have a different citizenship, so forth. So I think what Sony is counting on is the technological reality that it is, as they say, relatively easy for us to block one more thing, provided we're blocking it globally for everyone.
And at that point, we know where we're going. It's a dark place.
Exactly.
We've got about half hour left. I don't know if there's any other people on the chat want to come in and make some points. I'd encourage you to do that.
In the meantime, David, I was going to point something I've just put in the chat, and that's a link to what used to be called the Chilling Effects database. It was a project that was started by Wendy Seltzer and a few colleagues. And it's a database of these cease and desist type letters, you know, the request for removal of online materials. It all started out with request for removals of online material, and then went on to some more serious letters. And that database is quite fascinating because you can see the number of, well, primarily a lot of DMCA copyright complaints to big firms such as Google. And so you get the small firms, the small internet service providers that receive these very, very strongly worded lawyer letters with threats and so on, that immediately act because they think, well, we might lose our business altogether. And you get the large firms that are just complying with those things just for convenience, because at the end of the day, this is likely to be a cost, and they'd rather just push things through. So it's interesting, and if any of you are interested, you can search the notices on that database, which, as I said, is more than 10 years old and has thousands and thousands of such letters. So we're not dealing here with just isolated cases. And obviously those letters are not just empty threats. Many of them went on to the next stage sooner rather than later. And a lot of them are US based.
And one of the interesting things is they're really not looking to decrease the amount of piracy. They're looking to create an environment in which people will pay money to avoid a lawsuit progressing against them. And as long as the people being coerced out of money were people who had pirated the lawful property of somebody else, I really couldn't care less. That doesn't seem fundamentally unreasonable to me. But when the people being coerced out of money have nothing to do with any infringement, that seems like very clear overreach to me.
It's Japanese thinking, isn't it? 90% prosecution on their court system. So it's no surprise, is it?
Well, and this specific court in Hamburg has a unparalleled track record of finding in favor of copyright holders. And likewise, there is a court in West Texas that has an unparalleled record of finding in favor of patent holders. And allowing jurisdiction shopping to have global effects and global chilling effects because people want to avoid the lawsuit in the first place, knowing that they will lose it in some, little jurisdiction somewhere and be dragged through the mud. This is really the problem.
I think you're at the cutting edge of that non-existent international law for pan-national infrastructure. I think that's my view.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that, this is kind of a side note, but again, a difference between US law and German law that I was unprepared for and was very taken aback by. In the United States, the Internal Revenue Service, the tax authority, clearly distinguishes between for-profit and not-for-profit purposes, right? A for-profit private interest, their actions are taxable. A charitable organization that acts in the public benefit, as long as it really is the public and not, some set of private interests, however large, is not taxable. And specifically, donations to it are not taxable. So if a company or an individual chooses to give money to a charity, that money is not taxable for them, in addition to not being taxable to the charity. So in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service is very interested in ensuring that money that has not been taxed when it was earned by an individual or corporation because it then got donated to a charitable cause, not then be repurposed back to the benefit of an individual or corporate profit, because that would be tax evasion. In Germany, it turns out this is just not a principle for some reason. And so the notion that donor funds that were donated for the public charitable benefit of protecting the public at large from cybersecurity threats, under German law, there's just no problem with repurposing those the already untaxed donations for the benefit of Sony. And in the chat, Andrew's pointed out that in the UK, Sony would be required to pay the costs of any finding that required action on our part. And in Germany, that's not the case. And in fact, if we lose, we are not only responsible for all of our costs and our legal defense costs, but also all of the court costs and all of Sony's legal costs in bringing this against us. And that's just automatic. That's not a, they don't need to file a separate action to recover those from us. That's automatic. Or in the US, I mean, that's.
So would you ever consider, and I know that you're in Switzerland, but would you ever consider doing anything in tech in Germany ever again?
Well, I certainly wouldn't incorporate a new company there. No, I mean, if I were operating a global company and I had, you know, operations in many different countries, and I needed to have an operation in Germany, then yes, obviously I would, and I would have to deal with consequences of that. But as I said, Germany is now the first country that we are having to consider withdrawing from as a matter of compatibility with our principles. And absolutely weren't expecting that.
I note that Andrew Campling has had his hand up for a while. I wonder if we can allow him to take the floor. Let's see.
Can you bring him in, Paul?
I don't know.
I have the ability here, and I think.
Carry on.
Sorry, yeah, if you can, please, that'd be very kind. Thank you. Sorry.
Has that worked?
Yes, we see.
Excellent. Yeah. I don't think my camera's enabled, but at least you can hear me, which is important. Obviously, is an interesting chat. I just wanted to get to pick up on a couple of things. One, obviously, I mean, the whole thing about jurisdictions. I think Olivier, you made the sort of throwaway comment, which was then picked up in the discussion about the internet being global. And so I was simply going to observe, I think the sort of national jurisdiction being applicable to the internet, you know, I think that's a settled sort of matter as far as most national jurisdictions are concerned. They're very happy to assert their authority on sort of global matters, even though I still hear some internet companies, quite big ones, asserting that somehow their application of national legislation is entirely voluntary, and some are very vague about what jurisdiction they're located in. And of course, one of the prime examples of that jurisdiction being applied beyond national borders would be the US, with a combination of its Cloud Act and FISA 702, which, as I put in the chat, sort of destroys or completely overrules any concept of personal data and privacy, which is why I would always be cautious about storing personal data on a server operated by a US company, because by definition, US law enforcement agencies, of which there are very many, have warrantless access to the personal data of non-US citizens who are not located within the US, something which a lot of us, I think, maybe are oblivious about. And then just briefly diverting onto where you touched on DOE, which I thought Bill in particular covered very neatly. Again, as I put in the chat, I think part of the problem with DOE is there's been a long-standing sort of suggestion that if it's encrypted, it's private. And if I may say so, ISOC has been partly guilty in promulgating that view. And of course, you can have encrypted data that's going to pirates quite easily. So I think that's an issue. And of course, with DOE in particular, as sort of Bill touched on, there's no guarantee that an application provider will pay any attention to the sort of preferences of a user or device owner. There's no guarantee that they won't use cookies to make tracking even easier. And just building on what Bill said, also quite happily, the tracking is much more granular than even he suggested, because it's actually at the individual application potentially. So it's even better than just user granularity. You can theoretically track what I'm doing in the browser in particular, or what I'm doing with another application in particular. So it's far more fine-grained than it would be if I was using, as Bill said, DOT, with my data being amalgamated with that of others before it leaves the building.
Just to really quickly to touch on that before you go on to anything else, I think the point that you've just made, that encryption doesn't ensure privacy, is really critical. And the thing that people need to look at is who has the other key, and what is their position relative to other data that they can see and amalgamate to create a portfolio. So if you're using encryption, but then sending your data to a company that monetizes data, you've ensured that your data will not be private, because their whole business is to sell that data onward as many times as possible to as many parties as possible. So this is functionally the number one reason Quad 9 exists right now, is because it's not doing that. It's donor supported rather than data sales supported. And I think one of the things that you need to look at with some skepticism is this notion that, as Andrew is saying, that encryption by itself provides some benefit. And if we look right now, one of the big things that's happening right now is Apple talking about providing encrypted relays for essentially all Apple users, for Apple iCloud Plus users. And this is kind of like Tor. This is using ingress nodes and egress nodes and separating the two from each other administratively, so that the party seeing the data coming in sees who it came from, but not where it's going. And the party who sees the data going out sees where it's going, but not who it came from. Good in principle, as long as there's no other data source involved. But if the party who sees the data going out is also the party that's then going to respond to a query and tell the user, okay, now identify yourself by handing me back a cookie, or log yourself in with your username and password, so forth, then all of this is absolutely meaningless. None of that encryption is protecting you at all, because the party that it's intending to protect your anonymity from is in fact the party that's being handed to. So if Apple winds up partnering for exit nodes, so Apple has said that they will operate the entry nodes. And Andrew, just a plug for Andrew's Monday morning calls, Andrew got Apple on to answer some very hard questions, very tough questions 2 weeks ago. And Andrew, maybe you can put in the chat the link to the recording of that call. So Apple will operate the entry nodes, but then they have to hand off data to exit nodes operated by other parties. If Apple operated the exit node as well, then there'd be no privacy. So the question is, who will operate those exit nodes? And if those exit nodes are parties that also get to see the unencrypted traffic at the end and see how people authenticate and what cookies are used, then there was no purpose in the whole exercise. Sorry. Okay. So
just on the topic of encryption, and since this was mentioned, yes, the Internet Society is involved in a global campaign to defend the use of encryption. And I think when one talks about encryption on the Internet, in the Internet Society, we really wish for end-to-end encryption. So from one end to another end, with no decryption and whatever happening in the middle. Obviously, any party in the middle that is able to decrypt and then re-encrypt is the party that's going to have access to absolutely everything. But it does point out the fact that at the moment there are a number of governments around the world that are taking a serious look at having either some kind of encryption backdoors, or at defining limits to strong encryption. So perhaps by shortening keys or making some specific algorithms only possible through special licensing, or having the keys handed over to some kind of a department that would store these. And just in case there is a request by law enforcement to be able to access that traffic content, and it's a real concern because, as you know, the safety of those or the security level of many of these administrations has shown to be failing again and again, and many of this so-called top secret or highly confidential information ending up on the dark web more often than we can think of. So yeah, once those keys are out there, what will happen to security in general? We might be causing a way greater problems than the problem we're trying to solve, or the problem they are trying to solve.
If my mic's still working, just add a thought on that. It's interesting that a lot of the proponents of end-to-end encryption are, dare I say it, companies that have form with surveillance capitalism. So again, just because you've got end-to-end encryption, people often forget about the endpoints, and most of the more egregious privacy sort of issues over the last decade or so have been more to do with the endpoints than the bit in between, in my view. So I think it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of focus on the end-to-end encryption, and I would suggest that some of the companies that are pushing that line, perhaps diverting attention from where we should be rather more concerned about where privacy may be compromised. And in my view, it's far less likely to be the transit and far more likely to be at one or other of the endpoints.
This quickly devolves into a semantic argument over who the real endpoint is. And so if you're Cloudflare, you will argue that, well, of course you should be holding a certificate that is different than the end user is expecting and using that instead, because your business is to provide security for the website. And if the website had their own certificate and the end-to-end encryption happened between the user and the website, then users could abuse the website. But if your business is to stand between the websites and hypothetical abuse, then of course you are the real endpoint. And encryption between you and the website no longer matters. It's between you and the end user, and so you are the authority in this situation. Whereas, again, principle of least user astonishment, the user thinks they're going to a website. They don't know that Cloudflare is involved at all, and much less that the certificate they're being handed is Cloudflare's rather than the end sites, and that Cloudflare is seeing all the traffic unencrypted. So this question of who is the endpoint, it becomes this very kind of legalistic technicality. And yes, obviously end-to-end encryption is the goal, but in the absence of informed consent, users not knowing what the other end of that end-to-end is really, really problematic. And Quad 9 is seeing this a lot in our conversations with browser vendors. Browser vendors say pretty uniformly that if they were to actually enforce the certificate expectations of users, that most of the internet wouldn't work most of the time for a really significant portion of users who are getting man-in-the-middled by, their coffee shop, by, their router, by their firewall, by, their internet service provider. And a surprising number of these connections are being man-in-the-middle multiple times, despite the user seeing the little lock icon and thinking that they have end-to-end encryption.
Bill, we lost Jerome Sautzer a couple of years ago, I think 2018, but he wrote the seminal, I think it was PC Magazine paper that became the RFC defining DNS. And in it, he's very clear that you can identify them. Going back to your CDN example there, he specifically identifies routes, networks, and dual connected devices. I don't think we've really progressed since his original paper. And I think it's worth going back to that original work. And I think as we opened up with, Olivier said very clearly, we're not very good at saying what the servers and what's on the internet. And this has deviated strongly from the first call to even have DNS. I mean, I think that's a fundamental.
Yeah.
Go back to hosts.
So we have 10 minutes left. Perhaps if there are any remaining questions, we can.
Yeah, I did see earlier, but it was a long time ago. Adrian Firth had put his hand up, and I wasn't quite sure whether he still wanted to.
And Daniel as well. He put a link in.
Daniel as well.
Oh, my apologies. I hadn't realized that my hand was raised. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, gents. Paul?
Yeah, do we have anybody else with any questions? I can throw one into the mix if there isn't any other ones.
Sure.
Okay, possibly a little bit controversial. Are bad national laws making serious transnational problems worse?
I don't think that's a controversial question. I think that's a pretty clearly yes. The problem is that in a Westphalian environment, it is the right of every group of people to choose their own government and their own, forms of government and their own set of laws and so forth. And it's not the place of other people to impose their values upon them. And so the question of what's good law and what's bad law becomes very dependent upon your perspective. And, we are one kind of transnational organization which operates in the public benefit based on donations by people who believe that we're doing the right thing. And so we are responsible both to our users and to our donors to make sure that we get it right. And in some places that is fully compatible with the law, in the vast majority of places it's fully compatible with the law. And globally thus far, except for Germany, it's been also compatible with the interpretation of the law. And so it was our assumption that we would find ourselves in a court in a place that had much stricter law, and that law would be found against us. And then we would have to decide to withdraw from that country. But what we find, in fact, is a fairly vague and general law that's being interpreted in a vastly overreaching way in a much more liberal country.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up on that, because you made a very good point there, Bill. Is the issue too much regulation or not enough? Is this an issue that's solved by regulation or is solved by rolling it back?
I don't think it's that easy. I think that it has to be good regulation. And again, you run into this Westphalian problem, but ultimately that comes back to the interests of the users, the interests of the population. And if laws exist, if laws are there to protect the interests of the people, then I don't want to be exempted from those laws. GDPR, for all its faults and imperfections, is a vast improvement over what exists in the US, which is no protection for users.
Let me flip you another question then. If we're looking at regulation as, in principle, as an actor or an arbiter to improve things, does the deficiency, if indeed there is one, lie in the hands of the law or the regulation, or the actual fundamental integrity of the regulator themselves? Is it just a question that we need better regulators and the laws themselves, like GDPR, for all its flaws, because it doesn't include encryption, as we all know, is the issue that we need stronger and better regulators, maybe?
I think so. And the strength of the regulator.
By the way.
Say again?
Touching on what you're going through at the moment, could you have been aided, or whatever the right word is, if the regulators have been more effective and functional, shall we say?
I don't know that regulators would have helped us in this particular circumstance, but as an American who has dealt a lot with regulation in the United States, I think in the US we have in telecommunications a completely failed regulatory regime. In the US, regulators exist basically only as captured servants of a very small number of companies, 2 or 3 companies, and they act to the detriment of both the public and competition.
Because a lot of people would argue, for example, like the US Postal Service have been a really good regulator.
Well, and that's a complicated situation because they're also a service provider in that market.
I agree.
Postal regulation in the US is quite good, absolutely. Telecommunications, quite bad. Competition, so-so. So you've got regulations in a lot of different areas, and then you've got different jurisdictions, and it becomes a very multifaceted problem very quickly.
I think
So I think regulators being empowered to enforce their decisions is a good thing, but education and non-capture would be the single biggest thing with regulation.
The other thing,
thing is, regulators do have to run with regards to what regulation is written and also the laws that are out there. I was going to give a few examples of the extraterritoriality of laws, which I think is
touching on that point, Olivier, if I may.
Yeah.
I did a bit of work recently regarding things like data sovereignty. Now, what surprised me, touching on this territorial issue that you touch on, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys are the experts, not me, but the weighting on data sovereignty seems to be more in terms of the location of the person that's accessing the data than the physical location where it was physically being stored or reposited. And to me, that seems to be backwards, which is why I thought, take the opportunity, Paul, while you've got proper people like Olivier and Bill on the call, and ask the question, if they do mention territoriality, has everyone got it backwards?
I think so. I certainly think
that.
Dave's
here as well as a witness. Dave reckons I got this wrong, so I'm pleased he said that.
We've seen this sort of thing happen time and time again, and we're seeing the extraterritoriality of laws completely, and new laws, of course, being enacted, completely causing problems for third countries that had absolutely nothing to do with this. Some examples in some of the papers that the Internet Society have published in the past, the non-US companies being affected or targeted by American laws, including the 1996 Helms-Burton Act on bribery and sanctions relating to third countries. Of course, the Gdpr that's affecting companies worldwide, and ICANN is one of those organizations that is heavily affected by the GDPR. It's had a working group that has taken more than 2 years now to try and find solutions to some of the breaches and some of the problems there. And then, of course, also changes to some of the criminal laws in the People's Republic of China that include people or companies neither from nor in China who may be guilty of corruption against the Chinese state or its citizens. There are numerous examples out there and cases out there. There's also the whole right to be forgotten saga that was ruled by some courts as going in one direction and others in going in another direction, and which in some cases amounts to no less than actual censorship of data, rather than an individual wishing some of their not so great things when they did as a teenager being taken away from the record. So yeah, lots of examples like this.
Should we be looking to California for our lead or GDPR, do you think?
GDPR. I say that as a Californian.
Okay.
And my apologies. I have a hard stop right now with another talk I need to give. And so
absolute privilege and a free 3-year university education as far as I'm concerned. I really appreciate your time, but I wouldn't say that if I didn't mean it. You know me. But thank you ever so much. I deeply appreciate it. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Internet SG very much, but we really, really appreciate it. And I hope to God you walk through the open door another day as well. We'd love to have you back.
Take care.
Thanks.
So winding stuff up, and has anyone got any burning issues, do you think?
Yeah. Now that I've finished myself.
Is Ed Daniel still there? Did he want to talk? He put a nice link in. Ed? Maybe gone. Olivier, amazing as ever.
Absolutely. Again, Olivia, my previous comments to Bill, I direct them to yourself as well, sir. Absolute privilege. I'm so grateful. I feel like I've had a 3-year education in the space of the last hour and a half. I wouldn't say if I wouldn't mean it. Dave knows me. He knows that I'm very direct and I talk very straight, and I deeply appreciate it.
And welcome as a co-optee on the ISG committee. So
absolutely,
that's been a pleasure as well.
Yes.
Thank you very much for organizing this. It's been fun, and I hope that we can continue this kind of activity and joint meetings on a more regular basis. The whole pandemic has thrown us all behind our screens and behind our cameras, and it's unfortunately we haven't seen each other in person for such a while. It's good.
The biggest tragedy, and I speak as an academic, as we all are, the biggest tragedy for me, I'm being serious, the biggest tragedy of the pandemic is not being around intellectual titans who can speak with authority and conviction and substantiality on key topics. And with yourself and Bill this afternoon, we've had that, and it's redressing a lot we've all been through the last 12 months. And for me, it's been very, very therapeutic and cathartic, and I really, really appreciate it.
You're very kind, thank you.
I wouldn't say if I didn't mean it, because like I said, I've been around more clowns in the last 12 months than P.T. Barnum, and today has made it all better. So thank you ever so much. I think with that, what I'm going to do, unless anybody else has got any burning final topics, we could draw a line.
Andrew just mentioned in the chat, Andrew Campling mentioned his weekly call taking place at 1600 UK weekly, broadly linked to encrypted DNS.
Andrew, if you can hear me, it's Paul. If you've got a link that you'd like to share so everyone else can come on your call, please take the opportunity to do so.
And last but not least, I had a question for you, which was whether this, I note that this is being recorded. Was a recording going to be made freely available out there?
Absolutely. We would love to do that, because again, the value, and I put this on myself, the value of the education that I've had this afternoon, I would love everyone else to get the same benefit. And thank you deeply again, sincerely, for your time. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.